morning, everyone. My name is I'm professor of chemistry at Moulay-Ismaïl University in Rabat and one of the coordination committee of the congress. Today, it's my honor to introduce our first plenary speaker, Dr. Karen Serivener, from École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. She obtained her PhD at Imperial College in 1984. She worked for Lafarge in France for 6 years before being appointed professor and head of the Laboratory of Construction Materials, Switzerland in 2001. Her research focuses on the understanding the chemistry and microstructure of cement-based materials and improving their sustainability. She was made a fellow of the UK Royal Academy of Engineering in 2013. She will present her presentation on strategies to reduce CO2 emissions from concrete cost and asphalt. Would you do the honor, Professor, please?
Maybe one thing that I would like to add is that Karen is a member of the Engineering Council on energy transition, so usually she's advising the Secretary General of the United Nations, but today she will be advising us about how to reduce CO2 emissions. Karen, before you.
So thank you very much for these introductions. Can somebody, all right, you're doing the slides. So, you will put my presentation, or I'm going to do it. Can we have help to get the presentation? Okay. Could somebody please come and help get the presentation out? Oh, there's the pictures. Very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to open this conference on the scientific level, especially on International Women's Day. So I'm very pleased to present this talk where I will talk about strategies to reduce emissions from cement and concrete fast and at scale. And these last two words are really critical because we don't have much time left. Can I control the slides, please? Do you have a pointer I can use? So I think this is also important to underline that, you know, some people in Switzerland who live in nice, comfortable houses, they say, well, you know, we can stop building. But the reality for more than 1 billion people around the world is more like in the bottom picture here. I think we have to realize there's a very huge need for housing and construction, and we have to satisfy this demand, but we have to do this in a way that has the minimal impact on the environment. Now we have to act fast, because the scenarios for global warming have been well calculated, and as you see here we have different scenarios which are shown in different colors. All these scenarios will still lead to an increase over the next few decades, an increase even to 2 degrees. But only the bottom one, the one in yellow, is giving us any chance of reduction in the long term. And this is what is important. If we're not reducing in the long term, then really we are in big trouble. And in order to bring about this reduction in the long term, we need to act fast. We need to act now, and we need to go to zero net emissions by 2050. So it's no good having some fancy technology which can only be implemented in 50 years' time, because that's too late. Now, concrete and mortar are irreplaceable. Many people rather naively think we can replace concrete, for example, with timber. As you see here, the amount of timber we're using is about 5% of the amount of cement and concrete. And already we're cutting down more trees than we're planting. If we wanted to replace just 1/4 of cementitious materials with timber, we would have to plant a new forest 1.5 times the size of India. And even if we did this tomorrow, which would obviously be a good thing, it would be 30 years before that forest was producing timber. So on this horizon of 2050, we only have cement and concrete which can fulfill this demand for construction. But cement and concrete is not even a high energy material. As you see on this graph at the top right here, the materials based on cement have the lowest embodied energy and the lowest embodied CO2 per kilogram of all materials. Now you can say, well, per kilogram, that's not what counts. There has been a very nice study that came out last year, which really tried to look at what was the CO2 emissions per meter squared of building. And here we can see they compare different building types in concrete, in brick, in wood. We really can see that on average, the different materials are making hardly any difference. But what is staggering is in this first column for concrete, you see the huge dispersion. So if we can be aiming to get all our concrete buildings down here, we will have much more impact than trying to follow this myth that we can build everything in wood. The other very, very important thing is to see how the use of cement is changing dramatically. In the last 30 years, we've seen the development in China. China is now producing around 50% of all the cement in the world. But this situation will change dramatically in the next 30 years. And what we have to do, we have to anticipate this change and look where we can have most impact. Because you can only have impact on lowering CO2 before something is built. Once it's built, that embodied CO2 is locked in. And we see that in the next 30 years, the consumption in China will go dramatically down, and all the other regions of the global south, India, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and for some reason, the top one, which is Africa, has become white on this slide, which is not very convenient, but you should see Africa going up to here. The consumption in Africa is forecast to increase from 91 kilos on average to something more like the world average of 500 kilos. And this also means that while we all hear this headline figure about cement accounting for 8% of world CO2, when you break this down per country, you see, for example, in the United States, which is the third largest consumer of cement, cement is only accounting for less than 1.5 of the country's emissions. But in countries like Vietnam, Egypt, you see it's extremely high. It's about double what it is on average. So again, this shows the countries where we need to concentrate our efforts. Now the third message which is important is to realize that we cannot work on one level alone. I've already explained to you that there's no miracle substitute like timber, and we can and we should be making savings by working at all the different levels. We can work at the level of reducing the amount of clinker in cement. This is what I will talk about more. But then we have to follow that through by reducing the amount of cement in concrete and reducing the amount of concrete in buildings. And many studies have shown, for example, at the building level, many buildings are using twice as much concrete as needed, even while adhering to the existing building codes. And if we can bring these different steps of the chain together, it's really possible to achieve emissions of the order of 80%. And that's very important because what we're left with, so we have all these strategies that can reduce the CO2. We can reduce CO2 in buildings with often saving cost. We can reduce in cement and binder, again with overall zero cost. We can, in cement production, we can switch to fuels and energy, which has very low cost. And then we have this amount that is left. And this amount that is left will have to be dealt with by carbon capture and storage. And there you see this huge jump in the cost. The cost for this will be very expensive, and it will be very challenging. This on the right shows the pipe network that is predicted to be needed to deal with all the CO2 produced just in Europe. And when we now consider that most cement production will shift to developing countries, this is even more challenging to install this kind of network. So let's look again at where these CO2 emissions are coming from. Now, only a minority of the emissions, about 40%, are coming from the fuel used to produce the high temperature needed to produce clinker. More than 60% of the emissions are coming from the breakdown of limestone. Limestone is 80% of the raw material, and during the clinkering process, this breaks down to calcium oxide and CO2. And that is responsible for 60% of the emissions. Now, when people see this, they say, well, you know, let's make cement with a different chemistry. Let's stop using limestone. Now, unfortunately, that's not possible because we have to look at the composition of the earth. And we have just 8 elements which make up more than 98% of the Earth's crust. That's oxygen, silicon, aluminium, iron, calcium, sodium, potassium, magnesium. And we already know from what we read in the press that, you know, other materials are in short supply. We have challenges to get enough materials like lithium and nickel to make the electric batteries. We will need to have electric cars. So for a material which is produced in such very large amounts, we cannot look at all the elements in that remaining 2%. And then we have to consider how cement works. Well, very simply, what happens is we mix it up with water. We have these grey grains floating around in water. And first of all, they dissolve, like sugar dissolves in your coffee. And then they make new combinations, which precipitates as what we call hydrates, which are shown here in red. And these new solids, these hydrates, they are the things that glue the cement and the concrete together and give strength. So when we look back at the elements we have available, what we find is the oxides of sodium and potassium, they're too soluble, so they don't precipitate hydrates. On the other hand, the oxides of iron and magnesium, they have the opposite problem, they're too insoluble, so they don't dissolve. And this means we can go from the whole composition of the earth to the system of just 3 oxides of calcium, silicon, and aluminium, from which we can make cement. And this system has been studied for more than 100 years. We know there are only 2 regions in this where we have hydraulic compounds. On the left, we have the composition which is called Portland cement, and that's, you know, what is 99.9% of cement used in the world today. There's been a lot of recent interest in this other black region of calcium aluminate or calcium sulfoaluminate cement. And because this is further from the calcium oxide corner, it means you need less limestone, which is less CO2. But you cannot produce these compounds unless you have minerals which contain much more alumina compared to silica. So that takes us to something like bauxite, which is expensive because it's used to produce aluminium. And even if we took all the current bauxite production and diverted it, we still only produce 10% of cement. And even though these mixtures have less calcium, the savings are only about 10, 20, 30%, which you can easily reach better by substituting with other materials. And that's the strategy that can work, to use blended cements, where we substitute part of the Portland cement clinker with other materials. And these other materials are well known. They can be things like limestone, they can be things like fly ash, which comes from burning coal, they can be things like slag, which comes from producing steel, and calcined clay. Now the problem of these middle two is that fly ash and slag is these are coming from a very CO2 intensive process. The first thing we have to do to confront climate change is to stop burning coal. This is the most polluting fossil fuel we have. And hopefully people will stop burning coal, which means there will be no more fly ash. Similarly, slag comes from smelting iron ore, and as we move to less CO2 intensive processes, as we move to recycle more steel, the amount of slag will decrease. And even today, the amount of slag we have worldwide is only about 8% of cement production. So if people are saying, oh, I can achieve a low carbon concrete by putting in a lot of slag, in fact, maybe they have lower carbon in that one project, but because all the slag in the world is already consumed, in terms of what the world sees, which is what matters, it has no net benefit. Because you just take slag from one place and put it in another place, it has absolutely no benefit and can actually increase CO2 because you have to transport the slag around, because maybe you have to use alkali activation, which is CO2 intensive. So, slag very short supply, fly ash also fairly short supply and going down. What else can we use? Well, we can use limestone. There's a lot of limestone, but the problem is that if we go to substitution levels above about 20%, 15–20%, we simply have a dilution, and then we have to use more cement in the concrete, which doesn't help anything. What we do have is this calcined clay. So this is all being to really demonstrate to you why calcined clay is really the only thing that can dramatically change the situation. Because it can be used in blended cements, it's available very widely in the world, and it can be processed very fast. And more than that, what we realized at the beginning of this project is if we put calcined clay together with limestone, we get a synergetic reaction which can allow very high levels of substitution. And this is the technology we call LC3. So why does LC3 give lower emissions? Because we replace 50% or even more of the CO2 emitting clinker with a combination of calcined clay. It does have some emissions because it has to be calcined, that's to say heated up to about 800 degrees, but these are much lower than clinker. And the other part of the substitution is limestone, which only has to be ground, which has almost zero CO2. And what's really interesting is even with this high level of substitution of 50%, we can get the same or higher strength than the Portland cement at 7 and 28 days. So we have 50% less clinker, 10%, 40% less CO2, a similar strength, and much improved resistance to chloride penetration and alkali silica reaction. The reason we can go to these very high replacement levels is because of the structure of the mineral which is called kaolin. We need some clays that contain some kaolin, and when we heat this structure, which has one layer of silicates and one layer of alumina, to about 800 degrees, the structure becomes disrupted, and both the silica can react with the pozzolanic reaction, but also the alumina can react with the limestone to give additional strength, giving hydrates shown by this circle peak, which are called mono and hemicarboaluminates. And if we compare the calcined clay mixtures to mixtures we have with slag and fly ash, we see that at long ages, 90 days, 180 days, all these mixtures have roughly similar strengths. But if we look at the more practical ages where we need strengths, like 1 day and 4 days, then the calcined clays really strongly outperform slag and fly ash. And we can even bring the strength back at 1 day by working on the grinding process. So if we grind the clinker part slightly more finely, then we can have the same strength at 1 day. And it's really important to realize that clay is not just any other pozzolan. This is a graph from my colleague Franco Zunino, who will speak later, so I won't go into too much detail, but the important message here is that for pozzolanic cement with 60% clinker, you can match this performance with an LC3 mixture with only 25% clinker. So we need to have more intelligent standards. At the minute we have this very complex standard from Europe, which is treating everything the same. Even basalt qualifies as a pozzolan when it doesn't react. So if you make one of these cements with basalt, you will not at all have the same properties as if you make it with calcined clay. And for this reason we need to move towards performance standards, and that's a new Ryan committee which we launched this week here in Rabat. If people are interested to join, please contact me. So, as I said earlier, we need to have clays that contain kaolin. These are very widely distributed around the world. Anywhere we have this kind of orangey colour, then we will have suitable clays. And we can see here in Morocco, you know, you're in a region of Africa that has a lot of clays. So, you know, you can produce clays here. For many other countries in Africa, this is even more important because they don't have good deposits of limestone. So they have to import clinker. And being able to mix imported clinker with local calcined clay will be very important for local creation of jobs and for their balance of foreign currency. You can quantify the kaolin in the clay quite easily by looking at the weight loss between 400 and 600 degrees. We've now looked at more than 100 clays from all around the world with many different mineralogies. And what we see is that the performance correlates very closely with the kaolin content. And these red lines here, these indicate the reference strength of the plain Portland cement. So if you want to get the same strength as the plain Portland cement at 7 or 28 days, then you only need 40% kaolin. And this is extremely important because these kind of clays are really available everywhere. We're not talking about high-grade metakaolin, which is an expensive product, which is used in other industries for things like coating paper. We're talking about low-grade clays. And these clays can be calcined in existing technologies, in rotary kilns. You can even use an existing clinker kiln with minimal adaptation. You can also use flat calciners, and the CO2 emissions can be down to 90 kilograms per ton. That's about 1/10 of the emissions coming from clinker. So much less. And this has really gone to full scale. This shows one of the first houses we built in India with these materials. This shows a new calcination plant which has been erected in Ivory Coast, which is producing calcined clays. And what's particularly interesting about this plant was that they demonstrated the possibility to well control the colour. So many people are saying, well, you know, people don't want to have red cements, and we know cements can be very red. We know clays can be very red. But you can change the colour of this raw clay. It's very red. But if you do it in processing in the right way, you can easily produce this very dark grey material. So this can make nice grey cements that everybody is used to. Key advantages, as I said, resistance to chloride penetration. So anywhere where you have structures in contact with seawater, as is certainly the case here in Morocco, then this can have major advantages. This shows the penetration of chloride into different blends. The black is the plain Portland cement, which has the deepest chloride penetration after only 6 months. The red lines are the blends with slag, somewhat better. Fly ash, somewhat better again, here in blue. But the very best of all are the blends with calcined clay, and certainly best of all, calcined clay with limestone. And these blends have an effective diffusion coefficient, which is 10 times less than the reference Portland cement. So this will give you much longer service life and have all other kind of benefits. So let's look at the potential of this technology on a worldwide scale. This graph here shows the average level of substitutions and how it has changed over the past few decades. In the beginning, in the 1990s, when this trend started, there was a very big progress. And the level of substitution now has stagnated at around 20% for the last 10-15 years. And it's stagnated there because of this lack of availability of slag and fly ash. Now, if we remove this limitation, as it is very easy to do by using calcined clays, we could certainly go to levels of substitution around 40% on average. And that would be equivalent to saving 400 million tons of CO2 per year. To put that in context, that's 10 times the entire emissions of Switzerland, or 1% of all the world emissions. But I think on a horizon of 2050, we can certainly do much better than that. I think it's not stupid to think that we can go to an average substitution level of 55% or higher, which would save 800 billion tons of CO2 per year. So the potential is really enormous. And as I will show in a minute, it's not the end of the story. Financially, this can be a technology which is lower cost than producing LC3. And I'm glad to say that we're now working with people from all these countries around the world to introduce this technology commercially. There's been many announcements of commercial projects, like in Ghana, in France, in Denmark, etc. But as I said, it's not the end of the story, because we have to make sure we take this through to the next levels. So we have to take it through to the level of cement and concrete. And this can be as simple as making sure you have the good aggregate grading and you use admixtures. This graph was compiled 10 years ago from different mix designs published around the world. And what's important is to see the very huge dispersion. So the concretes up at the top maybe have 4 times the CO2 emissions of those ones down at the bottom. And this is clearly a potential for huge savings. You can reach these savings by moving from, in developing countries, from site mixing to using more ready mix. That's a very good way of making more efficient mix designs. What we certainly don't want to do, which is what is unfortunately a trend in many places, we don't want to go to 3D printing. Because 3D printing will take out the large aggregates, which means we need more cement. More cement is more CO2. So it's total hypocrisy what people are saying about 3D printing. This is a totally unsustainable technology. So we really see that we can bring about very big reductions at the cement level by increasing the substitution of SEMs, at the concrete level by minimizing cement content, and also at the structural level. At the structural level, simply by sticking to the existing codes, we can save a lot. All of these will lower cost. We will always have some CO2 left over, which has to be dealt with by carbon capture and storage, but this has high costs and the infrastructure is not less than yet in place. And on the first level, on SDMs, the calcined clays are the only realistic option for extending the use of SDMs, and they can be done now, and they can be done at large scale. But overall, now, what we have to do is to bring together the different segments in the construction chain. We have to bring together the material scientists with the civil engineers, with the structural engineers, etc., etc. And that's very much the objective of the Global Consensus, which was launched nearly 2 years ago by these 6 professional societies, right in there, FIB, CIB, the Structural Steel Association, etc. And if we can get these people talking together, understanding how to use materials in a good way and how to optimize the design of structures, we really can win this battle for the climate by bringing down CO2 emissions from cement and concrete to 0 by 2050. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Karen. Very interesting presentation. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Karen. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but the microphone isn't working.
I can speak loudly.
Yes, speak loud.
Thank you very much, Karen, for your very interesting presentation. I think maybe you forgot about some interesting but very ancient building materials, and think about the beginning of the presentation about comparison of concrete and CO2 emissions coming from concrete and other things. Stone, just dimension stone. Let's say the concrete era started after the, let's say, half of Europe was destroyed, and this is exactly the day when Raleigh was established. I'm not speaking about Bauhaus or some other episodes, but before, in our area, in many other countries, dimension stone, just normal dimension stone, limestone, dolomite, and basalt, and many other dimension stone which is built by nature was widely used.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't really forget about this. Now, of course, stone can be a very good construction material, but there are many issues about using it in very large quantities. First of all, because you have to join the blocks together with mortar, you cannot realize the full strength, and this means that because you're not realizing the full strength, you have to use large quantities. And this is the big problem, because now, we have this move to urbanization. We cannot stop this. And when people live in more and more dense agglomerations, it becomes very difficult to supply the amounts of building material. It's the same story with compressed earth. Compressed earth is a perfectly good building material, but in an urban environment, it's not practical to get the quantities of earth. And building in compressed earth, I lived in a very nice house in France, built like that, but the walls are 6 feet thick. And, we have to reduce the overall amount of materials we're using. So stone has its place, don't get me wrong, but it really cannot provide the answer. In the same way, timber is a very good material, but it cannot provide this large-scale answer. And this is what we need now. We need materials that can be provided at very large scale and very quickly. So, nothing against stone, but it's not a magic solution to this.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to introduce myself. I forgot. My name is Konstantin Kovalev. I'm from Israel.
Thank you, Costa. We have time for one more question. I think we had one over there. Yes?
So, Rabat from University. My question was the same for Earth, in fact, that the question asked for. So, and just to say, for example, in France, we produce more excavated soils that we put in landfills, that we produce natural aggregates. And you talked about Africa. In Africa, what happened? There was a tradition of earth construction, which is replaced by concrete. And in fact, obviously, since it is best, concrete has a higher environmental impact than the traditional solutions that are used in Africa. So, I don't completely agree with your analysis, but I think it's very complex, the question, and it needs hours of discussion to deeply understand the issue.
Just to add one more thing on earth, because as I said, earth can be a very good construction material, but what you should not do is try to stabilize it. Because when you stabilize it, when you put in what you think is a low dosage of cement, you get less mechanical yield per amount of cement than you do in concrete. So compressed earth, great, but don't think that putting in 5% of cement is an efficient material, because it's not. It has a higher CO2 footprint per megapascal than you do with concrete.
Totally agree.